The morning of 21st February 1944 began like so many others at RAF Kimbolton in Cambridgeshire, England. The pre-dawn darkness was pierced by the rumble of trucks, the shouts of ground crews. Fog clung to the runways, thick and gray, as it so often did in the English winter. But above the overcast, intelligence officers knew the sky would be clear, perfect bombing weather, perfect killing weather. High above southern Germany, within hours, an American B-17G flying fortress from the 379th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force, would claw its way through sub-zero air at 25,000 feet. The bomber was part of Big Week, the massive Allied offensive aimed at crippling Germany's aircraft production facilities, once and for all. It was a gamble, a calculated risk that would throw thousands of airmen into the teeth of the Luftwaffe and the most sophisticated air defense network ever created. At 25,000 feet, temperatures hover near minus 40 degrees Celsius. At that altitude, oxygen masks ice over within minutes. Zorro 430 hours. 21st February 1944. The briefing room was packed, rows of wooden benches filled with young faces, most not yet 25 years old. Some smoked nervously. Others sat in silence, hands clasped, lips moving in silent prayer. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and the smell of nervous sweat masked imperfectly by aviation fuel and coffee. Captain James O'Brien sat in the third row, flanked by his co-pilot, Lieutenant Robert Mac Mackenzie, and his navigator, Lieutenant David Thornton. O'Brien was 26, ancient by bomber crew standards. He had 15 missions under his belt. 15 times he'd crossed the channel, penetrated German airspace, and returned alive. 15 times he'd watched other aircraft fall from the sky, trailing smoke and fire, crews tumbling like rag dolls as they bailed out over hostile territory. 15 missions meant you were experienced. It also meant you knew too much. At the front of the room, the intelligence officer pulled back a curtain covering a large map of Europe. A collective groan rippled through the assembled crews. The red yarn marking their route stretched deep into Germany, far beyond the comfortable range of most fighter escorts, deep into the heart of the Reich's industrial capacity. "Gentlemen," the intelligence officer began, his voice cutting through the murmur. "Today is day 6 of Operation Argument. You know it as Big Week." Big Week. The name had a propaganda ring to it, something dreamed up by public relations officers safely ensconced in London offices. But for the men of the 8th Air Force, it meant something far more visceral. Maximum effort, maximum casualties, maximum exposure to the most lethal air defense network in human history. The target appeared on the map, Augsburg. Your primary target is the Messerschmitt assembly facility at Augsburg-Hounstetten, the intelligence officer continued. Secondary target, the MAN diesel engine plant. These facilities are critical to German aircraft production. Intelligence estimates they're producing approximately 60 Bf-109 fighters per month at this location alone. More murmurs. Augsburg meant deep penetration. It meant extended exposure to flak batteries. It meant Luftwaffe fighters would have ample time to organize coordinated attacks. Expected opposition, heavy flak throughout the route, concentrated defenses at the target, Luftwaffe fighter activity. Estimated 100 to 150 enemy aircraft. You'll have a P-47 escort to the German border, and P-51s will pick you up on the way back. But expect a 30-minute gap over the target area where you'll be on your own. 30 minutes. An eternity when every second brings you closer to disintegration. O'Brien glanced at his crew. Mac sat with arms crossed, jaw set. Thornton was scribbling notes on a pad. Headings, wind calculations, checkpoint coordinates. Behind them sat the rest of the crew. Technical Sergeant Frank Dutch Hollenbeck, the engineer and top turret gunner, Staff Sergeant William Santos, the radio operator, Sergeant Eugene Palmer, the ball turret gunner, and the waist gunners, Sergeants John Kowalski, and Raymond Tucker. In the tailgun position would be Sergeant Howard Mitchell, and lying prone in the nose compartment, manning the Norden bomb site, would be Second Lieutenant Anthony Moretti. The bombardier, 10 men, a single B-17, one mission among hundreds that day, weather over the target, clear skies, unlimited visibility. Temperature at altitude, -40 Celsius. Oxygen discipline is critical. We've lost too many crews to anoxia. Stay on your mask. Check your buddy's mask. Report any equipment failures immediately. The briefing continued with details on radio frequencies, emergency procedures, recognition signals. O'Brien absorbed it mechanically. After 15 missions, the ritual was familiar. What changed were the targets, the risks, the odds. Takeoff is scheduled for Aero 720 hours. Assembly over the wash at Angels 15 questions. There were always questions, small technical clarifications, anxious inquiries about rescue procedures if they had to ditch in the channel. But nobody asked the real question, the one that hung in the air like the cigarette smoke. How many of us aren't coming back? Statistics offered a grim answer. During Big Week, the 8th Air Force would fly approximately 300 bomber sorties and lose 137 heavy bombers, roughly 4% per mission. But statistics were cold comfort when you were one of 10 men sealed inside an aluminum tube, heading toward a sky filled with high explosives and tracer fire. The briefing ended. Chaplains moved among the crews, offering blessings, last rites for the Catholic boys, quiet words of encouragement for the rest. O'Brien declined. He wasn't superstitious, but he had his own rituals. He touched the St. Christopher medal his wife had given him, tucked inside his flight jacket. Then he stood, gathered his charts and maps, and led his crew out into the pre-dawn darkness. The fog was beginning to lift. The B-17G flying fortress that O'Brien and his crew would fly that morning was designated 42-31367. She was less than 4 months old, fresh from the Boeing plant in Seattle, one of 8,688 B-17Gs that would eventually roll off American production lines. She was painted in standard olive drab and neutral gray camouflage, though the paint was already chipped and stained by repeated exposure to high-altitude cold, oil, hydraulic fluid, and the occasional flak fragment. Her nose art featured a cartoon figure, a buxom blonde riding a falling bomb with the name Lucky Lady painted in flowing script beneath it. Every bomber had a name. It was a small concession to humanity in a machine built for industrial-scale destruction. As O'Brien approached the aircraft in the gray dawn light, he performed his ritual walk-around inspection. Ground crews had been working on her through the night. Routine maintenance, ammunition loading, fuel top-off. The bomber held 2,080 gallons of 100-octane aviation fuel. Her bomb bay was loaded with 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs, 6,000 pounds of high explosive that would, if everything went according to plan, rain down on the Messerschmitt factory in a few hours. The B-17G was the culmination of years of combat experience and design evolution. Earlier models, the B-17C, D, E, and F, had proven vulnerable to head-on attacks by German fighters. The G model addressed this with a chin turret mounting two 50 caliber machine guns beneath the nose, giving the bombardier the ability to return fire during frontal attacks. Combined with the other defensive positions, cheek guns in the nose, the top turret, ball turret, waist guns, and tail guns, the B-17G bristled with up to 13 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. The aircraft was a marvel of 1940s engineering. 4 Wright R-1820-97 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,100 horsepower at takeoff. Maximum speed, 287 miles per hour, though formation flying kept them much slower. Service ceiling, 35,000 feet, though most missions flew between 20,000 and 28,000 feet. High enough to avoid most light flak, low enough to deliver accurate bombing through the thin, freezing air. The airframe was built to take punishment. Self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb bullets without rupturing. Armor plating protected critical crew positions. The hydraulic and control systems had redundancies, multiple cables, backup system, contingencies for combat damage. But there were limits. Every aircraft, no matter how well designed, had a breaking point. "She's ready to go, Captain," said Master Sergeant Earl Kowalski, the crew chief. He was a man in his 40s, too old for combat crew, but indispensable on the ground. He knew every rivet, every wire, every temperamental quirk of the bombers under his care. "We replaced the number 3 engine supercharger. It was running rough yesterday. Oil pressure's good on all 4 engines. Oxygen system checked and topped off. Guns bore-sighted and test-fired. She's in good shape." O'Brien nodded. "Thanks, Earl. We'll bring her back." It was what he always said, a promise he couldn't guarantee but felt obligated to make anyway. "See that you do, sir." To understand the significance of this mission, and what would shortly transpire at 25,000 feet over Germany, requires understanding the strategic context of Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. By February 1944, the Allied air campaign over Europe had reached a critical juncture. The combined bomber offensive, launched in 1943, aimed to destroy Germany's capacity to wage war by systematically bombing industrial targets, transportation networks, and infrastructure. The Americans flew daylight precision bombing missions, while the British RAF conducted night area bombing. Together, they subjected the Third Reich to round-the-clock aerial assault. But the campaign was faltering. German air defenses had grown increasingly sophisticated and deadly. The Luftwaffe's fighter force, despite Allied optimism that it was on the brink of collapse, had actually grown stronger. New tactics, improved aircraft designs, and experienced pilots were exacting a terrible toll on American bomber formations. During the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission in August 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers out of 376 dispatched, a catastrophic 16% loss rate that was unsustainable. The problem was simple. The Allies couldn't win the air war if they couldn't achieve air superiority. And they couldn't achieve air superiority as long as German factories continued churning out fighters faster than the Luftwaffe was losing them. Operation Argument was conceived as the solution, a concentrated week-long offensive against German aircraft manufacturing facilities. The goal was not subtle: destroy the factories, cripple production, force the Luftwaffe to defend its industrial heartland, and attrite German fighter strength in massive air battles. It was a gamble. Concentrating so many bombers over such a short period meant accepting heavy losses. But Allied planners believed German fighter production had to be disrupted immediately before the spring of 1944, when preparations for the inevitable invasion of Continentals Europe would reach their crescendo. Big Week began on 20th of February 1944 with attacks on 12 German aircraft manufacturing plants. Over the next 6 days, the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, would dispatch more than 3,800 bomber sorties, dropping approximately 10,000 tons of bombs on targets across Germany and Austria. The cost would be staggering. 137 bombers lost in combat, another 21 written off due to battle damage. More than 2,600 airmen killed, wounded, or captured. But the strategic results would justify the carnage. German aircraft production would be severely disrupted. Luftwaffe fighter losses, both in combat and on the ground, would prove irreplaceable. Most critically, the defensive battles over Germany would deplete the Luftwaffe's pilot cadre. Experienced airmen, veterans of years of combat, would be killed in numbers that Germany's training programs could not replace. By summer 1944, Allied air superiority over Europe would be absolute. But on the morning of 21st of February, none of this was certain. The men climbing into their bombers knew only that they were part of something enormous, something unprecedented, and that the price would be paid in blood. 07 Mimdias Albor RAF Kimbolton, the four Wright Cyclone engines of Lucky Lady coughed to life one by one. Each ignition was a controlled explosion, spark plugs firing, fuel atomizing, pistons beginning their rhythmic hammering. The noise was tremendous, a bone-shaking roar that made conversation impossible, even inside the aircraft with headsets on. O'Brien ran through his checklist methodically. Magnetos? Checked, Mac responded. Oil pressure? 60 pounds per square inch, all engines green. Hydraulics? Pressure normal. Oxygen? System charged and flowing. The ritual continued. Every switch, every gauge, every control surface verified. In a bomber, there was no room for improvisation at 25,000 feet. Checklists were written in the blood of crews who'd learned too late what happens when you skip a step. Around them, across the airfield, dozens of other B-17s were coming alive. The sound was apocalyptic. Nearly 40 bombers, 160 engines, producing enough noise to rattle windows in villages miles away. At Izuru 720, the green flare arced into the sky from the control tower. Time to go. O'Brien released the brakes. Lucky Lady began rolling, slowly at first, then gaining speed as the engines throttled up. The bomber was heavy, combat loaded with fuel, bombs, ammunition. The grass runway seemed to stretch forever. Airspeed alive, Mac called out. 50 knots, 60, 70. The tail came up. The vibration smoothed slightly as the weight transferred from the tail wheel to the main gear. 80 knots, a almost call. 90, and Violna committed now. Even if an engine failed, they had to try to fly. Rotate. O'Brien pulled back on the yoke. The bomber's nose lifted. For a moment, the main gear still rumbled across the grass. Then, almost imperceptibly, the vibration ceased. They were flying. Positive rate of climb, Mac confirmed. Gear up. The landing gear retracted with a thunk and whir of hydraulics. O'Brien trimmed the aircraft for climb, adjusted power settings, and turned to the assigned heading. Now came the assembly, one of the most complex and dangerous phases of every mission. 40 individual bombers had to form up into a cohesive combat formation, while climbing through clouds, navigating by radio beacon and stopwatch, avoiding mid-air collisions in the murky soup of English weather. It was organized chaos, a three-dimensional ballet performed by aluminum machines weighing 65,000 pounds each, flown by young men who'd learned their trade in 6 months of rushed training. The assembly point was over the Wash, a bay on England's east coast. Each bomb group launched colored flares to help crews identify their assigned formations. The sky above the Wash became a surreal display. Red flares, green flares, yellow flares, all against the gray overcast, with bombers circling like massive, deadly insects. It took 90 minutes. By 0900 hours, the 379th Bomb Group had formed into a tight combat box, a defensive formation designed to concentrate defensive firepower. The idea was simple but elegant. If enemy fighters attacked, they'd face interlocking fields of fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. In theory, this made attacks costly for the Luftwaffe. In practice, German fighter pilots had developed tactics to exploit weaknesses in the formation, attacking from angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire. Lucky Lady took her position in the formation, middle group, slightly to the right. Around her, the other bombers maintained precise spacing. Too close risked collision, too far reduced defensive coverage. At 09:15, the entire formation, now a bomber stream stretching for miles, turned east and began climbing. Ahead lay the Channel. Beyond that, the continent. Beyond that, Germany. And waiting in the frozen sky over Germany, the most lethal air defense network ever created, primed and ready to turn this beautiful, clear winter day into a crucible of fire and steel. The English Channel passed beneath them quickly. A strip of gray water, whitecaps just visible from 15,000 feet. The bomber formation continued climbing, ascending through layers of thin cloud, engines straining in the thinning air. At 18,000 feet, O'Brien ordered the crew onto oxygen. "All stations, pilot, go on oxygen and check in." One by one, the crew responded. Co-pilot on oxygen, navigator on oxygen, bombardier on oxygen, engineer on oxygen. Down the list, each man confirming he was connected to the life-giving flow that would keep him conscious in the thin atmosphere ahead. Anoxia, oxygen, starvation, was insidious. It crept up slowly, making you feel euphoric, confident, invincible, right before you lost consciousness and died. Crews had been found after missions with dead men still at their stations, frozen solid, unaware they'd suffocated because an oxygen line had kinked or a valve had frozen shut. By the time they crossed into Belgium, the formation had reached its cruising altitude, 25,000 feet. The world at 25,000 feet bore little resemblance to the earth below. The sky was a deep, almost purple blue. The sun blazed with unfiltered intensity, and the cold was absolute, a cold that penetrated layers of fleece-lined leather, wool, and silk. Inside the aircraft, despite the crew's heavy flight gear, breath condensed into ice crystals that coated every surface. Thornton, the navigator, worked his charts in the nose compartment beside Moretti. His fingers, even inside heavy gloves, were growing numb. Navigation at this altitude required constant vigilance, wind drift, compass deviation, checkpoint identification. A few degrees off course sustained for 30 minutes could put the formation miles from its intended target, wasting bombs and exposing crews to defenses they'd carefully planned to avoid. "Navigator to pilot, we're on course. ETA to the German border, 12 minutes. "Copy that," O'Brien responded. 12 minutes to the edge of hell. The formation flew on. Contrails streamed behind each bomber, white ribbons of condensed engine exhaust that stretched for miles, making the formation visible to enemy radar and observers on the ground from dozens of miles away. There was no hiding, no surprise. The Germans knew they were coming. At 10:15 hours, the formation crossed into German airspace. "All stations, pilot, we're in the Reich. Arm your weapons. Test fire on my mark." Throughout the bomber, gunners chambered rounds and charged their weapons. The 50 caliber Brownings were formidable, each gun capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, each bullet a half-inch in diameter, capable of punching through aluminum, flesh, and bone with equal ease. "Test fire in 3, 2, 1, mark!" The bomber shuddered as every gun fired a short burst. Spent brass cascaded onto the floor. The smell of cordite filled the aircraft. "All guns operational," came the reports. Good, they'd need them. At 10:28 hours, the radio crackled with the first warning. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high." Dutch Hollenbeck in the top turret swung his guns to the right. Through the plexiglass dome, he could see them. Tiny black specks against the blue, growing larger by the second. Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Maybe a dozen of them, forming up for an attack. "Fighters coming in," someone shouted over the intercom. The German fighters came in fast, diving from above and to the right. A classic bounce intended to scatter the formation. But the bomber crews held formation. Breaking ranks meant isolation. Isolation meant death. The lead 109 opened fire at 800 yards. Too far for accuracy, But the tracers, 1 in every 5 rounds, was a phosphorus tracer that burned bright red, drew lines of fire through the sky. At 400 yards, the bombers returned fire. The sound was deafening. Multiple .50 caliber guns hammering, brass raining down, the acrid smoke of gunpowder filling the aircraft. Tracers from multiple bombers converged on the attacking fighters. 109 staggered, trailing black smoke. It rolled inverted and began spiraling downward. No parachute appeared. "Got one!" Dutch shouted. "Splash one fighter!" But the others pressed their attacks. More tracers. The distinctive sound of cannon fire. The German 20mm cannons had a slower rate of fire, but packed devastating explosive rounds. Thunk, thunk, impacts, somewhere aft. Tail gunner to pilot, we took hits in the tail section. No critical damage, systems still functional. Copy tail, the fighter attack lasted less than 2 minutes. A violent, chaotic brawl at 300 miles per hour. Then the German fighters broke off, diving away to regroup, or low on ammunition. Silence returned. Relative silence, anyway. The engines still roared, the wind still howled through the aircraft. But the guns were quiet. O'Brien checked his formation. 2 bombers had dropped back, 1 trailing smoke from an engine. But they were still flying. "Navigator, give me an update." "We're on course, Skipper. 20 minutes to the IP." The IP, the initial point. The spot where the bomb run would begin, where the formation would have to fly straight and level for 5 agonizing minutes, maintaining course and altitude regardless of flak or fighters, so the bombardiers could line up their targets through the Norden bomb sites. 5 minutes of being a stationary target in a shooting gallery. 20 minutes until that ordeal began. But first, they had to get there. And ahead, on the ground, German radar operators were tracking their every move, feeding coordinates to flak battery commanders, who were even now elevating their guns, setting fuses, preparing to fill the sky with high explosives. The bomber stream flew on, silver shapes glinting in the winter sun, engines droning, men watching the sky, waiting for the black bursts of flak that they knew were coming, waiting for the moment when luck, good or bad, would determine who lived and who died. 1,400 hours, 25,000 feet over southern Germany. The landscape below had transformed into a patchwork of snow-covered fields, dark forests, and the gray sprawl of German cities. From 5 miles up, it looked peaceful, almost serene. But that illusion was shattered by what lay ahead. Black flowers were blooming in the sky. "Flak at 12 o'clock, came the call over the intercom. The first bursts appeared perhaps 2 miles ahead. Dark puffs of smoke that materialized against the blue hung there for a moment, then dissipated. Each puff represented an 88mm shell that had climbed 25,000 feet in seconds, detonated with mechanical precision, and sent thousands of jagged steel fragments screaming outward at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The German 88mm Flak 36 was a masterpiece of engineering, directed by radar and optical rangefinders, operated by experienced crews who'd been perfecting their craft since the war's beginning. These batteries could bracket a bomber formation with terrifying accuracy. A direct hit wasn't necessary. The burst radius was 200 feet, close enough to shred control surfaces, puncture fuel tanks, or kill exposed crewmen. O'Brien felt his stomach tighten. After 15 missions, he'd never gotten used to flak. Fighter attacks were somehow easier. You could shoot back, maneuver, do something. But against flak, you could only maintain formation, hold course and altitude, and pray that the next burst wouldn't have your name on it. "Tighten up the formation," the lead aircraft radioed. "Bomb run in 7 minutes. 7 minutes. The flak would only get worse as they approached the target. The black bursts multiplied. What had been a handful became dozens, then hundreds. The sky ahead looked like it was boiling with dark, angry clouds. Each burst made a distinctive sound, a sharp crack, followed by a metallic rain of fragments pattering against the bomber's aluminum skin. The sound merged into a continuous thunder. Inside Lucky Lady, the crew was silent. Each man focused on his task, trying to ignore the fear that clawed at their throats. Palmer, cramped in the ball turret beneath the aircraft, could see the flak bursts below and around him. Too close, always too close. Mitchell, in the tail, watched bombers behind them, noting which ones were taking hits, which ones were falling out of formation. Dutch Hollenbeck, in the top turret, had the worst view. He could see everything. The entire formation, the flak field they were flying into, the fighters circling at a distance, waiting for cripples. Jesus, he muttered, not realizing his intercom was still hot. Cut the chatter, O'Brien said quietly. Navigator, time to IP. 5 minutes, Skipper. 5 minutes to the initial point. Then the bomb run would begin. 5 more minutes of straight, level flight while Moretti lined up the target through his Norden bomb sight. 10 minutes total of being a sitting duck. The flak intensified. A burst exploded 100 feet to the left, close enough that Lucky Lady rocked from the concussion. Fragments spanged off the wing, leaving silver scars in the olive-drab paint. Another burst, closer still. The formation flew on. At 14:08 hours, they reached the IP. Bombardier to pilot, I have the aircraft. Standard procedure. During the bomb run, the bombardier controlled the aircraft through the Norden bomb sight, making tiny adjustments to heading and altitude to line up the crosshairs on the target. Far below, Moretti lay prone in the nose, eye pressed to the rubber eyepiece of the sight. Through the optics, he could see the Messerschmitt factory, a collection of buildings and hangars arranged in a distinctive pattern. Wind data, altitude, airspeed. The Norden computed it all mechanically, adjusting the aiming point for drift. Steady, Moretti called. Holding course, holding altitude. The flak was at its worst now. The German gunners knew the bombers couldn't maneuver during the bomb run. They were concentrating fire, walking their bursts through the formation like a farmer plowing a field. Crack, 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 crack. The sky had become a solid wall of black smoke and steel fragments. A bomber 200 yards to the left took a direct hit. The entire wing separated from the fuselage. The aircraft rolled inverted and began falling, spinning like a maple seed. Parachutes blossomed. 1, 2, 3, not enough. The crew was 10 men. Steady, Moretti repeated, his voice tight. 30 seconds to release. 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours. Crack. The bomber shuddered. More fragments, more hits, but nothing critical, not yet. 20 seconds. Another bomber fell out of formation, nose down, trailing fire. 10 seconds. Hold it. Hold it. Bombs away! The aircraft lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of high explosive dropped free, all across the formation. Bomb bay doors were opening, bombs tumbling out, falling toward the factory below. Pilot has the aircraft, O'Brien said, banking slightly to follow the lead ship away from the target. Almost there, almost through it. Then, at 14:12 hours, it happened. The 88mm shell detonated 3 feet from the forward fuselage. There was no warning, no time to brace, no time to pray. One moment, Moretti was securing his bomb sight. Thornton was plotting their exit course, and the aircraft was flying normally. The next moment, the world exploded. The blast wave hit with the force of a freight train. The entire nose section, the plexiglass bombardier's compartment, the navigator's station, the forward bulkhead, simply disintegrated. Not damaged, not torn. Disintegrated. Metal, plexiglass, equipment, maps, all of it vaporized or ripped away in an instant. The bombardier's compartment ceased to exist. What remained was a gaping wound, a ragged opening that exposed the cockpit to the full fury of 300-mile-per-hour wind at 25,000 feet and minus 40 degrees. Moretti was slammed backward by the blast, his safety harness the only thing preventing him from being sucked out into the void, his oxygen mask ripped free, his heated suit's electrical connection severed. In seconds, frostbite began attacking his exposed face. Thornton, positioned slightly behind and above Moretti, grabbed a structural beam with both hands. His charts, his instruments, his maps. Everything that wasn't bolted down vanished into the screaming wind. His boots scrabbled for purchase on the bucking floor. In the cockpit, the effect was apocalyptic. The windscreen shattered inward. The control panel exploded in a shower of glass and instrument fragments. The hurricane of wind blasted into the confined space with physical force, driving ice crystals and debris into O'Brien's and Mac's faces. The aircraft pitched violently downward. "Jesus Christ!" Mac shouted. O'Brien fought the controls. Nothing. The yoke moved freely in his hand. No resistance, no response. The control cables had been severed. The elevator cables that controlled pitch. The aileron cables that controlled roll. The trim cables that allowed fine adjustments. All of them ran through the nose section. All of them were destroyed. Lucky Lady was no longer an aircraft. She was 65,000 pounds of metal, fuel, and human beings falling out of the sky. The artificial horizon gyro spun wildly. The altimeter unwound. The airspeed indicator climbed. 24,000 feet, 23,000 feet, 22,000 feet. They were diving, nose down, the aircraft beginning to roll as asymmetric forces took over. "We're hit!" Dutch shouted from the top turret. "Forward section is gone!" "Bail out!" Someone screamed. "Bail out!" O'Brien tried the rudder. It responded. Barely. But without elevator control, he couldn't arrest the dive. Physics was in control now. Gravity was pulling them down, air resistance was tearing at the wounded airframe, and structural limits were approaching fast. At this speed, in this configuration, the wings could shear off at any moment. 21,000 feet. 20,000 feet. "Navigator!" O'Brien shouted into the intercom. "Bombardier, report." Static. Wind noise. Then, faintly, "Navigator here. Bombardier's alive. We're still in the aircraft, but the nose it's gone, Skipper. It's just gone." 19,000 feet. O'Brien's mind raced through options. Bailout was the obvious choice. Ring the alarm bell, give the order, and everyone jumps. Some would survive. Some would be captured. Some wouldn't make it. But they were over Germany, deep in enemy territory. And even if they survived the jump, what then? POW camps, interrogation, years of captivity, and his crew, his responsibility at 1,000 feet. Mac was staring at him, waiting for the order. "Skipper, we have to jump." O'Brien looked at the controls. Dead. Useless. Then he noticed something. The throttle quadrant, the controls for the 4 engines, was still functional. When he adjusted power on the left engines, the aircraft rolled slightly to the right. When he adjusted the right engines, it rolled left. "Mac," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Asymmetric power? If we can't control the aircraft with the cables, maybe we can control it with the engines." "That's insane." "You got a better idea? 17,000 feet." The dive was steepening, but O'Brien reduced power on all 4 engines, trying to slow the descent. The effect was minimal but noticeable. They were still falling, but not quite as fast. 16,000 feet. Dutch Hollenbeck unbuckled from the top turret and climbed down into the fuselage. The wind was incredible. Even here, behind the cockpit, it was a physical force. making movement difficult. He keyed his intercom. "Skipper, I'm going forward to check on Thornton and Moretti." "Negative, Dutch. It's too dangerous." "They're still alive up there. I have to try." Before O'Brien could respond, Dutch was moving forward, hand over hand along the catwalk toward what used to be the nose section. What he saw stopped him cold. Where the bombardier's compartment should have been, there was nothing. Just open air, wind, sky. And below, visible through the gaping hole, the German countryside rolling past at 200 miles per hour. Thornton was clinging to a structural support beam, his face blue from cold and oxygen deprivation. Moretti was on the deck, harness holding him in place, barely conscious. And dangling in the wind, visible in the wreckage, Dutch saw something. Steel cables, control cables. Some were severed completely, their ends whipping in the wind. But others, the thin trim cables that provided fine control, were still partially attached. They were no longer connected to the control wheels in the cockpit, but they were still attached to the control surfaces on the tail. A crazy idea formed in Dutch's mind. "Skipper," he called over the intercom, "I can see some of the trim cables. They're damaged but not completely severed. If Thornton and I can grab them, if we can pull them manually, so we might be able to move the control surfaces." Silence for a moment, then O'Brien's voice, steady despite the chaos. "Say again, Dutch." "We can fly this thing by hand. Like a kite. We grab the cables, we pull, and maybe we can get enough control to level out." "That's," Mac started to say. "That's brilliant," O'Brien finished. "Do it, but secure yourselves first. I'm not losing anyone." Dutch climbed out into the maelstrom. The wind tried to rip him away. The cold was instant and total. His exposed hands went numb in seconds despite his heavy gloves. His oxygen hose stretched to its limit, the rubber stiff and brittle in the freezing air. He reached Thornton first. The navigator's eyes were wide with shock and hypoxia. "David!" Dutch shouted over the wind. "I need your help. We're going to fly this thing manually." Thornton stared at him, as if he'd lost his mind. Then slowly, understanding dawned. He nodded. Together, they identified the cables. The main elevator cables, severed. The aileron cables, gone. But the trim cables, thinner and more flexible, were still there. One controlled pitch trim, another controlled roll trim. Dutch grabbed the pitch trim cable with both hands. It was barely thicker than his finger, steel wire wrapped around itself, normally meant to be adjusted by a hand wheel, not pulled by raw muscle. "On 3, Dutch shouted. 1, 2, 3. They pulled. The cable moved. Somewhere back in the tail section, the trim tab on the elevator shifted. In the cockpit, O'Brien felt it. A tiny change, barely perceptible but real. "It's working," he called. "Keep pulling." For 10 minutes that stretched into eternity, Dutch and Thornton manually flew the B-17. Pulling one cable brought the nose up slightly, arresting the dive. Pulling another induced a gentle roll, correcting the aircraft's tendency to bank. It was brutally physical work. The cables were stiff, the force is enormous. Every pull required maximum effort. Their hands, even inside thick gloves, began to bleed as the steel wire cut through fabric and leather. Their muscles screamed. The cold sapped their strength with every second, but they couldn't stop. If they stopped pulling, the aircraft would pitch back into the dive. If they lost control for even a moment, it was over. In the cockpit, O'Brien and Mac worked the throttles like musicians playing an instrument. More power on the left engines to correct a roll, less power on the right to stop an overbank. Constant adjustment, constant compensation. It was coordination born of desperation. And incredibly, impossibly, it was working. The dive arrested at 12,000 feet. The aircraft leveled out. They were flying again. Sort of. The formation had long since left them behind. They were alone now, a crippled bomber limping through German airspace, 400 miles from safety. But they were flying, and nothing. Tail gunner to pilot, Mitchell's voice came over the intercom. We've got company, bandits, 6 o'clock low, German fighters. They'd spotted the cripple. An easy kill. O'Brien's jaw tightened. All gunners, prepare to engage. We're not going down without a fight. The Messerschmitts came in fast, diving from behind and below. But before they could close to firing range, other shapes appeared. Sleek, beautiful, deadly. P-51 Mustangs, American escort fighters. This is Red Leader to damaged B-17, a voice crackled over the radio. We've got you covered. Head west. We'll clear the road. The Mustangs dove on the German fighters, engaging them in a swirling dogfight that pulled the threat away from Lucky Lady. O'Brien allowed himself a single moment of relief. Then he focused on the impossible task ahead, flying a mortally wounded bomber 400 miles back to England. The flight back was a blur of pain, cold, and determination. Dutch and Thornton continued their brutal work, pulling cables until their hands were numb and bloody. Moretti, semi-conscious from hypoxia and shock, was strapped into a makeshift seat, wrapped in every blanket the crew could spare. The aircraft couldn't maintain altitude above 15,000 feet. The constant manual control didn't allow for precision. So they descended slowly, trading altitude for distance, always heading west. The P-51s stayed with them as long as fuel allowed, driving off 2 more attempted fighter attacks. When the Mustangs finally had to turn back, their leader radioed. "Good luck, Lucky Lady. You've got guts." They crossed the German border into Belgium, then France. Each mile was a victory, each minute another chance at survival. The crew worked with mechanical efficiency. Santos, the radio operator, transmitted their position and condition to rescue services. Palmer climbed up from the ball turret to help Thornton, giving the navigator's exhausted arms a brief respite. Kowalski and Tucker stood ready to administer first aid to anyone who collapsed. But no one collapsed. Fear, adrenaline, and sheer stubborn will kept them going. At 16:30 hours, the English Channel appeared below, a strip of gray water that had never looked so beautiful. "Land ho," Mac said, quietly. They'd made it to England, but they still had to land. RAF Kimbolton was alerted that Lucky Lady was inbound with catastrophic damage. Emergency crews stood ready. Ambulances lined the runway. The tower cleared all other traffic. O'Brien began his descent from 50 miles out, losing altitude gradually. Without proper elevator control, a normal approach was impossible. He had to plan for a long, shallow glide, using engine power to maintain the descent rate. At 5 miles out, the airfield was visible. The runway looked impossibly short. "Landing gear down," O'Brien ordered. Mac pulled the gear lever. The hydraulics groaned. The indicator lights flickered. Main gear down and locked nose gear. Nose gear shows unsafe. Of course it did. The nose section was gone. The gear probably had nowhere to lock properly. "We'll land on the mains and let the nose settle," O'Brien decided. Everyone brace for crash landing. Assume the position. Throughout the bomber, men grabbed hold of structural supports and prepared for impact. O'Brien lined up with the runway. His airspeed was too high. Without flaps or proper elevator control, he couldn't slow down. They'd be landing hot. "Dutch, Thornton, on my mark. Pull everything you've got. We need to flare." The runway rose to meet them. Too fast. Way too fast. Now, Dutch and Thornton pulled with the last of their strength. The nose lifted slightly. The main gear touched down with a screech of rubber and a shower of sparks. The aircraft bounced, settled, bounced again. The nose dropped. Metal scraped concrete with a sound like the world ending. Lucky Lady slid down the runway in a shower of sparks and smoke, slowing gradually, the screech of tortured metal overwhelming everything. Finally, after 2,000 feet of runway, she stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then Max said, "We're down. We're actually down." Fire trucks raced toward them. Ambulances followed. One by one, the crew unbuckled and helped each other out of the aircraft. When ground crews arrived, they stared in disbelief. The entire nose of the bomber was gone. The aircraft looked like it had been bitten in half by some mechanical monster. "How the hell did you fly this thing?" one crew chief asked. O'Brien, his face gray with exhaustion, looked at his crew. Dutch, with his bloody hands. Thornton barely able to stand, Moretti being carried on a stretcher. All of them alive. "We pulled together," he said simply. Epilogue, legacy, all 10 crewmen survived. Captain James O'Brien and Technical Sergeant Frank Hollenbeck received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Lieutenant David Thornton and Lieutenant Anthony Moretti were awarded air medals with oak leaf clusters. The entire crew received Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in action. Aircraft 42313-7, Lucky Lady was written off as unrepairable, but photographs of the bomber, with its entire nose missing, circulated throughout the 8th Air Force. They became legendary, proof that human will and determination could overcome impossible odds. The mission itself was a success. The Augsburg raid destroyed significant portions of the Messerschmitt production facility, contributing to the overall success of Big Week. German aircraft production was disrupted for months. The Luftwaffe never fully recovered. But for the men who flew that day, the victory was more personal. They had faced death at 25,000 feet and refused to surrender. They had flown an unflyable aircraft through sheer force of will. They had pulled together when every instinct screamed to bail out and save themselves. They had proven that survival in the air war was not just about machines or firepower or tactics. It was about human beings, about trust, about refusing to let go, even when the sky itself was trying to tear you apart. Years later, when veterans gathered to share stories, this one was always told with reverence. The fortress that refused to die, the crew that flew by hand, the impossible flight that should never have succeeded. But it did, because 10 men decided that giving up was not an option.